The rope burned through her palms like a brand, and Maude Hayes bit down on the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper. She would not cry. She had promised herself that much when she buried her father 3 weeks ago in the rocky caliche soil of Dry Creek, Texas, with nothing but a borrowed preacher and a handful of neighbors who came more out of curiosity than grief. She would not cry, and she would not ask for help, and she would survive this God-forsaken piece of land that her father had left her, with its crumbling fence line and its dried-out creek bed, and this well, this impossible well, whose rope had frayed nearly through at the middle, and whose bucket had sunk somewhere below the waterline because her wrists lacked the strength her father's had carried for 40 years. She pulled again. The rope slipped. The rough fibers shredded another layer of skin from her right palm, and the bucket dropped another foot deeper into the darkness, and somewhere behind her, not 10 feet away at the fence line she had not heard him cross, a man watched. Wesley Carson had not meant to watch. He had ridden in from his own property to the east, the Carson spread that bordered the Hayes land, along a half-mile of cedar posts and rusted wire, intending only to check whether the widow Hayes needed her deed transferred properly with the county clerk in Abilene. He had told himself that was all it was. He had told himself that 3 times on the ride over. He had not told himself why his chest had gone tight the moment he cleared the ridge and saw her silhouette at the well, saw the rope slipping, saw her stumble and catch herself against the stone coping with her forearm instead of her hands, because her hands were occupied and bleeding and refusing to surrender. He was beside her before he made the conscious decision to move. His hand closed over the rope above hers, and the bucket's descent stopped as though it had never thought about sinking in the first place. He was taller by a full head, with the kind of shoulders that came from 12 years of working land rather than inheriting it, and the rope went still in his grip, the way ropes always went still for men who had the calloused certainty of someone who had pulled stubborn things back from the edge of lost. Maude Hayes turned, and for one raw, unguarded moment, her face showed everything. The exhaustion, the grief, the specific humiliation of being caught needing what she had refused to ask for. Then her jaw set and her brown eyes steadied themselves, and she said the words that would later seem to Wesley Carson like the beginning of everything. "I had it," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know." And he pulled the bucket up anyway, hand over hand, steady and unhurried, while she watched him and hated him a little for making it look simple, and hated herself more for the relief that moved through her like the first breath after a long time underwater. That had been the moment. That had been the needle through the thread. But to understand how 2 people as stubborn and as scarred as Maude Hayes and Wesley Carson ended up standing beside a crumbling well on a September morning in 1882, with their lives about to become completely tangled with each other, you had to go back further. You had to go back to the secrets they had both carried into Taylor County, Texas, like stones sewn into the lining of a coat, heavy and hidden and fundamentally changing the shape of everything they wore. Maude had come to Dry Creek from Galveston 4 years earlier, 22 years old and carrying 2 things: a carpetbag with everything she owned and a name that did not fully belong to her. Her birth name had been Maud Sinclair. She had become Maude Hayes when she married Elias Hayes, a man 30 years her senior who had answered a need rather than inspired a feeling, who had needed a woman to run his household after his first wife died of fever, and who had offered in exchange a piece of ground and a roof, and the respectability that a woman alone in 1878 Texas required the way lungs required air. She had liked Elias well enough. He had been decent and hardworking and had never raised a hand to her, which she understood even then to be a standard set deliberately low, but one that still mattered. She had cooked for him and kept his house and learned to read the land's moods the way you learned a difficult person's, and when he died of a heart failure that took him between one breath and the next on a Tuesday afternoon in late August, she had grieved him with the particular sadness of someone who had never been able to love the thing they had genuinely cared for. The grief was real. The loss was real. What was complicated was the inheritance. Elias had 3 adult children from his first marriage, none of whom lived in Taylor County, all of whom believed their father's land should come to them rather than to the woman they had privately called a schemer, and publicly called his second wife with a coldness that added syllables to the word. 2 of them, the eldest son Rutherford and the daughter Constance, had arrived in Dry Creek within a week of Elias' burial, and they had brought with them a lawyer from Abilene named Mercer, who wore a city coat and carried papers and spoke in a voice designed to make a woman doubt what she understood to be true. The land was hers. Elias had drawn up the deed properly, filed it with the county, left it to her in a will that had been witnessed by Judge Hollies in Abilene 2 years before his death. Mercer had looked at those documents and found nothing legally actionable, which had not stopped him from suggesting, in the smoothest possible way, that a woman alone managing a cattle operation on 40 acres of difficult Texas ground was perhaps not in anyone's best interest, including her own, and that a fair cash settlement might be arranged if she were willing to sign a transfer. Maude Hayes had asked him to leave her property. That had been 3 weeks ago, the same week they buried Elias. Since then, Rutherford Hayes had not left Dry Creek. He had taken a room at the Salty Dog boarding house in town, and he had begun, in the careful, unhurried way of a man who believed he had time on his side, to make her life difficult. A section of fence went down in the night and 30 of her cattle wandered onto the road toward Abilene, and it had taken her 2 days to gather them back. The new hired hand she had arranged to take on through the end of fall had appeared, received some kind of conversation from someone in town, and declined the position without explanation. Her credit at Dunbar's Dry Goods had been quietly questioned by a rumor she could not fully trace that suggested her deed might be contested, and therefore her financial standing was uncertain. She had not cried about any of it. She had fixed the fence herself with wire she had borrowed on the promise of repayment, and posts she had cut from the cedar stand at the back of the property. She had gathered her cattle herself. She had gone to Dunbar's and paid cash for everything she needed, which had left her with $11 and some cents until she could get the fall cattle to market, which was a problem whose shape she tried not to look at directly in the dark of 3 in the morning when the house was quiet, and the weight of everything pressed down without anyone watching. The well rope was the latest thing. She had known it was fraying for a week. She had been managing it carefully, lowering and raising the bucket with a deliberateness that compensated for the weakened fibers. That morning she had miscalculated, or her arms had been too tired from the fence work, and the bucket had dropped, and the rope had slipped, and Wesley Carson had appeared at her fence line as though the desperate machinery of her circumstances had conjured him out of thin air. She did not know him well. She knew him the way you knew neighbors in that part of Texas in 1882, which was to say she knew his name and his land and the broad facts of his reputation. Wesley Carson, 28 years old, owner of the Carson spread which had been his father's and grandfather's before him, known in Dry Creek as reliable, known in Abilene as a man whose cattle arrived in good condition and whose word was as solid as anything written. He had been at Elias' burial. She remembered that now, standing at the back with his hat off and his expression correct and careful. She had not spoken to him there. She had not had the space for anything beyond the mechanical grief of that day. He stood at her well now with the bucket resting on the stone coping, water sloshing over the lip onto his boots, and he looked at her with a directness that was not rude and was not apologetic and was simply present in a way that she found, to her considerable annoyance, stabilizing. "The rope needs replacing," he said. "I am aware of that," Maude said. "I have hemp rope in my barn, good quality. I could bring it over." She wanted to say no. The word was loaded and ready in her mouth. The automatic refusal of someone who had learned that accepting help created obligations and obligations, created vulnerabilities and vulnerabilities, or how people who wanted what you had got close enough to take it. But she looked at her hands, the torn skin of her palms red and already beginning to stiffen, and she looked at the bucket, and she thought of the morning after tomorrow when she would need water again and the frayed rope would slip again, and she made the harder choice, which was the practical one. "Thank you," she said. "What would you want for it?" Something moved in his expression that she could not entirely read. "Nothing," he said. "I don't take charity," she said, and she said it without heat, as a simple statement of fact about herself, the way you'd say I don't take sugar in my coffee. "It's not charity," he said. "Consider it a neighborly exchange. Your fence line on the north section runs close to mine. If your cattle cross, I have an obligation to return them. It's simpler if your operation stays functional." It was the most practical framing of generosity she had ever heard, and she appreciated it precisely because it did not require her to feel grateful in any visible way. She gave him a short nod. "I'd be obliged." He rode back to his property and returned within 2 hours with a coil of thick new hemp rope over his shoulder and a spare bucket in his hand, because he had noticed, without commenting on it, that the current bucket had a split seam. He replaced the rope himself, threading it through the pulley mechanism at the top of the well frame with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before, and she stood nearby and watched and hated how competent it looked and how much easier the bucket moved when he lowered it the first time, smooth and controlled, perfectly balanced. "The pulley needs grease," he said. "I know," she said. She had a list. The list was very long. He glanced at her. "I could, one thing at a time, Mr. Carson." He accepted that. He pulled the bucket up full and heavy and set it on the coping without spilling a drop, and he stood back and looked at his work with a satisfaction that was entirely unself-conscious. Then he looked at her hands. "You should wrap those," he said. "I have cloth in the house." "Good." He did not offer to help with that. He seemed to understand something about the dimensions of acceptable help. Some interior map of where the line was that she had not drawn explicitly, and yet he navigated it with a precision that unnerved her a little. He picked up his tools and his empty supply sack and he turned to go, and Maude Hayes did something that surprised herself. "Would you take coffee?" she said. "I have it on. It's the least I can offer." He turned back and looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a casual look, and she saw in his dark eyes something she recognized without being able to name, the particular expression of someone who also carried weight, someone who had also learned to manage instead of show. "I would," he said, "thank you." They sat at her kitchen table, which was a rough-hewn affair that Elias had built 20 years ago, and which had the comfortable solidity of something that had never needed to be anything other than exactly what it was. She poured coffee into 2 tin cups and wrapped her hands in strips of clean cloth while the coffee cooled, and he sat across from her and did not make her feel observed, which was a more sophisticated social skill than she had expected from a rancher in Taylor County. "Rutherford Hayes is staying in town," he said. It was not a question. "You've heard," she said. "People talk in Dry Creek," he said. "They have very little else to occupy themselves." "What are they saying?" She lifted her cup with both wrapped hands and watched his face. "They're saying the deed is contested," he said, "which it isn't from what I understand." "It isn't," she confirmed. "Elias filed it properly. Judge Hollies has a copy in Abilene." Wesley wrapped both hands around his own cup and looked at the table for a moment. "Rutherford talked to Jake Dunbar," he said, "and to Porter at the feed store, and I believe he had a conversation with the man you'd hired for fall work." "I know," she said. "I've been watching it happen." "What are you going to do?" "Manage," she said. The word came out harder than she intended, with the force of someone who had been saying it to themselves every morning for 3 weeks and needed to keep believing it. He nodded. He did not press her on whether managing was sufficient or realistic, which again surprised her. Most men she had known would have felt obligated to point out the practical limitations of a woman alone trying to run 40 acres against a determined campaign of quiet sabotage. They drank their coffee in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which was itself unusual enough that she noticed it. She noticed also that he smelled of horses and cedar and clean sweat, not unpleasantly, the honest smell of outdoor work, and that his hands around the tin cup were broad and scarred in the specific patterns of rope and fence wire. Not the casual, elegant scars of a man born to land, but the working scars of someone who had rebuilt something, had perhaps had to fight to keep it. "Your family has held the Carson spread a long time," she said. Not quite a question. "My grandfather came to Taylor County in 1857, he said. "My father built the main structure. I've been running it since my father died, 8 years now." "You were 20, she said. Yes, she absorbed that. 20 years old and inheriting a cattle operation with all its obligations and its complexity, the particular loneliness of responsibility before you were fully grown into yourself. She understood something about that. "Did people try to take it from you?" she asked. He looked up from his coffee. She had asked it directly without softening it, and she watched him decide whether to answer in kind. "There was a man named Garrett," he said. "He had a ranch to the north. Claimed my father had promised him water rights from the East Spring. There was no such promise and no such document, but he had friends in town and my father had just died and I was 20 years old with a full crew to pay and cattle to get to market." He paused. "It took 2 years to resolve. Judge Hollies was the one who finally settled it. He's a fair man." "I've heard that," she said. "I may need to go see him." "I think you should," Wesley said, "before Rutherford finds a way to create enough noise that the county clerk starts asking questions. The deed is solid, but solid things can be made to look complicated if someone is sufficiently motivated and has enough time." It was exactly what she had been afraid of, spoken plainly. She found she appreciated the plainness more than she would have appreciated reassurance. He left shortly after, and she stood in the doorway and watched him ride east toward his own land, the horse moving at an easy canter through the yellow September grass. And she thought about the way he had appeared beside her at the well before she had asked, before she had even turned to see if anyone was there. And she thought that either that was the most unsettling thing that had happened to her in weeks, or it was the most reassuring, and she could not decide which. She thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, Rutherford Hayes came to her door. He was a tall man with his father's jaw and none of his father's decency, broad through the shoulders in a way that was designed to occupy space as a kind of argument, and he wore good boots and a clean shirt in a pointed demonstration that he was not struggling the way she was supposed to be struggling. He stood on her porch with his hat on, which was deliberate, and he smiled with the portion of his face that was not involved in the smile. "Maude," he said, "I wanted to have a plain conversation." "Then take your hat off," she said, "and come inside and we can have one." He came inside. He sat at her kitchen table. He took his hat off and held it in both hands, and he looked around her kitchen with an expression of proprietary assessment that made her want to put something heavy between herself and his gaze. "This is a hard life for a woman alone," he began. "Many things are hard," she said. She did not sit. She stood near the stove because it put the stove behind her and it put her on her feet, and she had learned long ago that standing conversations were different from sitting ones. "My father's debts," he said, and he let the words sit there. "What debts?" she said carefully. "There's a note at the Abilene Bank," he said, $120, taken out against this property 2 years ago. She kept her face still. Elias had not told her about a note. She did not know if that was an omission he had meant to address or something Rutherford was inventing now with the confidence of a man who knew she could not immediately disprove it. "I would need to see the documentation," she said. "Of course," he said. "Mercer has it." He paused. "The thing is, Maude, if that note comes due and isn't satisfied, the bank has a claim on this property, which complicates your deed somewhat. If there is a legitimate debt of my husband's estate," she said, keeping her voice level, "it would be resolved through the estate, not through my personal deed to the property." He blinked just slightly. He had not expected her to know that. "Well," he said, "these things can be complex." "Bring me the document," she said. "I will take it to Judge Hollies in Abilene and we will proceed correctly." He rose and put his hat back on with the deliberateness of a man recalculating. "I only want what's fair," he said. "So do I," she said. "I believe that's something we have in common." He left. She let out a breath she had been holding so carefully it had become painful, and she sat down at the table and put her wrapped hands flat on the wood and looked at the knots in the grain and thought hard. A banknote. It might be real. Elia's had been private about certain financial matters. Or it might be manufactured. A forgery Mercer had prepared at Rutherford's instruction, which was an illegal act, and therefore a risk that a man desperate enough might take. She needed to get to Abilene. She needed to talk to Judge Hollies, and she needed to go to the bank herself, and she needed a witness she trusted. And she had been in Dry Creek 4 years, and the list of people she trusted unconditionally was uncomfortably short. She found herself thinking about Wesley Carson. She told herself it was purely practical. He knew Judge Hollies. He had experience with exactly this kind of property dispute. He was her neighbor and therefore had a natural interest in the stability of adjacent land. She ran through all of these logical reasons carefully while she saddled her horse, which was a process that currently required twice the usual time and twice the usual profanity because of her wrapped hands, and she rode east along the fence line to the Carson spread. The Carson property was visibly different from hers in ways that had nothing to do with the land itself and everything to do with what 8 years of steady, purposeful management could accomplish. The fences were whole. The barn was solid. The house was modest but well-maintained, with a real porch and shutters on the windows, and a kitchen garden along the south side that someone had planted and tended with care. There were cattle in the far field, good-looking animals, roan and black and reddish-brown in the September light. Wesley Carson was in the corral working with a young horse when she rode up, moving with the horse in the specific patient way of someone who had learned that you could not force a young animal into trust, but had to arrive at it by stages. He saw her coming and did not stop what he was doing, but he moved with an economy of motion that suggested he had registered her arrival and was bringing the work to a natural pause rather than an abrupt one. The horse calmed under his hands, and he looped the lead rope over the fence rail and came to meet her. He looked at her face and read it correctly. "Come inside," he said. His kitchen was tidier than she had expected for a man living alone. There were hooks with coats and tools on them in the right places, and the table was clean, and the stove was properly banked. He put coffee on without asking, and she sat and told him about Rutherford's visit in full, including the banknote claim. He listened without interrupting, which was a quality she was beginning to specifically value. "The First Cattlemen's Bank in Abilene," he said when she finished. "That's where he'll have filed any such claim. If the note is real, it will be registered there and you can see the original documentation and have it examined. If it's not real," he paused. "Mercer wouldn't be the first lawyer who crossed a line when the money was sufficient." "I need to go to Abilene," she said. "I know," he said. "When?" She looked at him. "I was going to ask if you would come with me." He poured the coffee and set a cup in front of her and sat across from her, and she watched him think it through. Not hesitate exactly, but consider, which was different. There was something behind his eyes when he thought that she had noticed each time they had spoken, some interior process that was careful and precise, as though he had learned to examine things from multiple angles before he moved. "Yes," he said, "I'll come." "I can pay you for your time," she started. "No," he said, simply, without offense. "When do you want to go?" "Day after tomorrow," she said. "I need to arrange for the cattle to be checked while I'm gone." "I'll have my man Colfax ride your property," Wesley said. "He's reliable." She started to object to that too, and then stopped herself. There was, she was finding, a specific internal cost to refusing every offered hand, and the cost was not pride but rather a kind of loneliness that compounded like interest over time. "Thank you," she said instead, and meant it with less resistance than the last time she had said it to him. They left for Abilene on a Thursday morning before sunup, the sky still purple and the air carrying the first real suggestion of fall, cool against her face after the brutal heat of the summer. She rode her own horse, a bay mare named Clem that Elias had given her, and Wesley rode a gray gelding that moved with the comfortable indifference of a horse that had covered a lot of ground, and intended to cover a lot more. They rode side by side on the road toward Abilene, which was 40 miles east and a long day's ride. For the first hour they were mostly quiet, and the quiet was the kind that two self-sufficient people who were not yet entirely comfortable with each other maintained by looking at the landscape and thinking their own thoughts. Then the sun came up over the flat eastern edge of the world in a wash of orange and gold that turned everything briefly spectacular, and Maude said without planning to, "God, this country is beautiful," with a feeling in her voice that was not performance but genuine startlement, the way beauty could still catch you off guard even in the middle of a crisis. Wesley looked at the sky and then looked at her looking at the sky. "It's something," he said. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked. "The same view every day." "No," he said. He said it immediately without thinking. "I've been looking at this sky my whole life and it is never the same sky twice." She turned that over in her mind. It was a more philosophical observation than she had expected, and it made her recalibrate him slightly again. She was finding that she was doing that regularly, revising her estimate upward each time he said or did something that exceeded the framework she had built for what a Texas rancher in 1882 was likely to be. "You've never wanted to go somewhere else?" she asked. "Somewhere more, what?" he said. "More finished, more settled." "I was going to say more populated," she said. "I went to San Antonio once," he said. "When I was about 16, my father took me for a cattle negotiation. All those people, all that noise, and the buildings so close together you couldn't see the sky unless you looked straight up." He shook his head. "I understand why people want it. I don't want it for myself. I grew up in Galveston," she said. "It was very populated and very loud, and I sometimes miss it the way you miss a thing you've outgrown, with a kind of fondness and a kind of relief that you don't have to go back." He looked at her with genuine curiosity. "What brought you to Taylor County?" She was quiet for a moment, deciding how much of the truth to give him. He had been straight with her. She had a feeling that whatever else Wesley Carson was, he was someone who valued honesty and who would respect it in return. "I needed somewhere to be," she said. "Galveston was full of what I'd been, and I needed somewhere with space enough to become something different." He nodded as though that was a complete and sufficient answer, which she appreciated because it was the honest core of a more complicated story that she was not ready to tell in full. Not yet. They reached Abilene by mid-afternoon, the town arriving gradually out of the flat distance, its buildings solidifying from haze into shape, the sounds of it reaching them before they could read the signs. Abilene in 1882 was past its wildest days, but still had the particular energy of a cattle town at the end of a long season, the sense of money moving through the place, of men and animals and decisions all converging. The streets were wide and dusty, and the boardwalks were crowded enough that they had to thread their horses carefully to the livery. They went first to the bank. The First Cattlemen's Bank of Abilene was a solid brick building on Chestnut Street, with a counter of polished wood behind which sat two men in collared shirts, who looked up with the specific wariness that bank employees directed at people who might want to dispute something. Maude stated her business plainly. She was Maude Hayes, widow of Elias Hayes, holder of the deed to the Hayes property in Dry Creek, and she was here to inquire whether a promissory note of $120 existed against that property. The clerk consulted the ledger. It took a while, and Wesley stood beside her at the counter with his hat in his hands and said nothing, and she was aware of his presence as a kind of ballast, steady and physical and calm. The clerk came back. There was no such note registered in the bank's records against the Hayes property. Maude felt a cold clarity move through her. Rutherford had invented it, or Mercer had on his behalf. Which meant they were willing to commit fraud, which raised the stakes of everything considerably. She thanked the clerk. She and Wesley walked out into the afternoon sun, and she stood on the boardwalk and let herself absorb the implications without reacting to them visibly, because she had learned long ago that the boardwalk in a cattle town was a public stage and she did not perform for audiences. "Fabricated," Wesley said quietly. "Yes," she said. Which means they're more desperate than I thought or more ruthless. I haven't decided which is worse. Both are manageable, he said. She looked at him. How? Judge Hollies, he said. Tell him exactly what Rutherford said. That he claimed a note existed, that you came here and verified it did not. That establishes a pattern of deliberate misrepresentation, and Hollies can put it on record. If Rutherford tries it again in any form, he's now on notice that you are documenting his actions. She studied his face. You've done this before, she said. Not just your own situation. You've helped someone else navigate this. He was quiet for a beat too long. My mother, he said, after my father died. His brother came from Dallas claiming my father had borrowed money from the family. The claim was false, but it cost us 2 years of legal struggle before it was settled. I learned how these things work. There it was. The thing she had been sensing in the careful architecture of his patience, his specific understanding of exactly what she was facing. He had faced it himself, had learned it with his mother at his side, had carried the knowledge forward. I'm sorry, she said. That must have been very difficult. It was, he said, but it made us harder to fool afterward. They went to Judge Hollies' office, which was on the 2nd floor of the courthouse. Arthur Hollies was a compact man in his late 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the expression of someone who had spent 30 years hearing people's worst behavior toward each other and had not yet lost the capacity for outrage. He remembered Wesley Carson by name and shook his hand with the warmth of genuine respect. He reviewed Maude's deed, which he confirmed was properly filed and legally sound. He listened to her account of Rutherford's bank note claim and wrote it down in a ledger with careful handwriting. He looked at her over his glasses. Mrs. Hayes, he said, what you have described constitutes attempted fraud. I cannot charge Rutherford Hayes with anything today because the claim was made verbally and he has not yet submitted any false documentation. But this record now exists. If he proceeds, I will be prepared to act. What if he finds another way? She asked. Hollies tapped his pen on the desk. What other way are you anticipating? I don't know yet, she said honestly. He is creative and he is motivated and he has money enough for a lawyer. I have a feeling the bank note was a test to see how I'd respond. When he learns I went to Abilene, he'll try something else. Hollies looked at Wesley. You're her neighbor. Yes, sir, Wesley said. Keep an eye on things, Hollies said. And Mrs. Hayes, anything that goes onto paper, any document presented to you by Rutherford Hayes or his representative, you bring it here before you sign anything or respond to it. Do not let them create a paper trail that moves faster than you can check it. She thanked him and they left, and they were back on the street in the long afternoon light, and Maude felt something loosening in her chest. Not the problem. The problem was still fully present, but the specific terror of facing it alone had shifted. She was not alone at this moment. The judge knew her name and had written it in his ledger, and beside her was a man who understood every step of the terrain. They took supper at a restaurant on Pine Street, an actual restaurant with tablecloths and a woman who brought them plates of beef and beans and fresh bread. A slight luxury that Maude had not allowed herself since Elias died because luxuries required the absence of crisis, and she had not yet reached the absence of crisis. Wesley ordered the food and ate it with the uncomplicated appetite of someone who had ridden 40 miles and done useful things and earned a meal, and she watched him across the table and found that she liked the way he occupied space, without apology and without excess. What will you do when this is settled? He asked. When Rutherford is gone and the deed is secure. What's your plan for the property? She thought about it. No one had asked her that. Everyone had been focused on the crisis, including herself. I want to run it properly, she said. Elias had 40 head when he died. I want to build that up. I want to repair the barn properly, not just patch it. I'd like to try growing some winter feed so I'm not entirely dependent on buying it. She paused. I'd like to put in a second well at the north end of the property. That section is too far from the existing one. He was listening with that real attention she had come to recognize, the kind that meant he was storing it rather than simply hearing it. "The land on your north section has a good gradient," he said. "My father looked at it once when we were discussing water. He thought there was a reasonable aquifer at around 60 feet. "Do you know a well digger?" she asked. "I know 3, he said. "All reliable," she smiled. It was the first real smile that had crossed her face in weeks, and she felt it come up from somewhere, unexpected, and she saw him register it, saw something shift in his expression, not something she could precisely name yet, but something that had weight and intention. "You know a great many useful things, Mr. Carson," she said. "Wesley," he said. It was the first time he had offered his first name, and he said it quietly, without ceremony, just a correction, but it landed with the small significance of a door opening. "Wesley," she repeated. "I'm Maude." "I know," he said. They rode back to Dry Creek the following morning, having spent the night at separate respectable establishments, she at the widow Colburn's boarding house and he at the hotel on 3rd Street. The ride back was different from the ride out, looser, with more conversation that moved through different territories. His memories of Taylor County in the 1870s and what the land had looked like before the range was fenced. Her memories of Galveston in the days before the changes that had come with the railroads and what the sea smelled like in summer. A detail she offered without thinking, and which made her realize she had not talked about the sea to anyone in 4 years. "Do you miss it?" he asked. The sea, she understood. "Less than I expected," she said. "I thought I would miss it every day. For the first year I did." Now she looked at the flat, golden distance of the Texas plain. "Now I think I replaced it with this. It has the same quality somehow, the way it goes on." He nodded as though that made sense to him. "What do you miss?" she asked. "From before you were carrying everything." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought she might have overstepped, had asked something too private for the still new territory of whatever this was between them. Then he said, "My father used to tell me things while we worked. Not important things, not instructions or corrections, just things he'd noticed. A hawk he'd seen that morning. The way the south pasture looked when the grass came back after a bad drought. He had a way of paying attention to the world and then sharing what he saw with whoever was beside him." He paused. "I miss having someone to tell things to." The words were quiet, and he said them without self-pity, just a simple, true statement, and Maude Hayes felt them move through her with a resonance that had nothing to do with the useful, practical connection they were building, and everything to do with something older and more fundamental, the recognition of a mirror, someone who had been carrying the same particular weight. "I know that feeling," she said quietly. He looked at her, and in the clear morning light, with the distance spreading around them and the horses moving steady beneath them, she looked back. And what passed between them in that moment was not yet named, but was entirely real, like weather you could feel coming before you could see the clouds. They returned to Dry Creek by mid-afternoon. Wesley checked with Colfax, who reported the Hayes cattle were undisturbed and the property quiet. He delivered this information to Maude, who thanked Colfax directly and specifically, which the older man received with a slight look of surprised respect. Wesley noticed that. He noticed that she treated the people who worked for her as though their attention mattered, which was not universal and was, in his experience, one of the more reliable indicators of character. 3 days later, the second thing happened. Rutherford Hayes had apparently received the information about Maude's trip to Abilene and had adjusted his strategy. The new approach was a rumor, more targeted than the first, designed not to damage her credit or her legal standing, but to damage something less concrete and more destructive, her reputation. The rumor, as reported to her by Mrs. Dunbar, the dry goods store owner's wife, who told her with the apologetic directness of a woman who believed in information over ignorance, was that Maude Hayes had been seen in Abilene in the company of a man who was not her husband, traveling together and spending the night, and that a woman in her circumstances who was already suspected of having married old Elias Hayes for his property was not, perhaps, the kind of person whose claims should be automatically credited. It was elegant in its viciousness. It attacked simultaneously her morality, her grief, and the legitimacy of her deed, and it was unanswerable in the way that rumors were always unanswerable, because to deny them was to repeat them. Maude went home and stood in her kitchen for 10 minutes without doing anything. Then she went to the barn, saddled Clem, and rode to Wesley Carson's property, because she had to tell him before he heard it from someone else, and because she did not know what to do and she was going to have to admit that. She found him mending fence in the east pasture, working with the steady, methodical pace she was coming to recognize as his natural mode, and she rode up and told him what Mrs. Dunbar had said, all of it without softening it. He set his tools down and looked at the fence post and then at the sky and then at her, and she saw in his face not embarrassment but anger, the kind that was quiet and cold and went all the way down. "He is using my name against you," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'll go to town," he said. "I'll go to Dunbar's and I'll state clearly to whoever is present that we went to Abilene on a legal matter pertaining to your property, that we stayed at separate establishments, that Judge Hollies and the bank clerk can confirm the nature of our business." "That's," she started. "It's the truth," he said. "And it addresses the rumor directly, which is better than letting it run. It will embarrass you," she said, "to be associated with this kind of talk." He looked at her steadily. "Maude," he said, and her first name in his voice had a different weight than it had had 2 days ago, something more decided in it. "Nothing about helping you embarrasses me, and I will not let Rutherford Hayes use the fact of my help as a weapon against you if I can do anything about it." She felt something crack, slightly, in the careful structure she maintained around herself. Not break crack, the way a tight-sealed room would crack if someone opened a window, the specific shock of air moving. "Thank you," she said, and she did not qualify it or caveat it this time. He went to town. He did exactly what he said he would do, went into Dunbar's dry goods store at a time when he knew there would be people present, greeted Jim Dunbar, and mentioned, in the course of a natural-seeming conversation, that he had accompanied his neighbor Mrs. Hayes to Abilene on the matter of her property deed, and that Judge Hollies had confirmed the deed was perfectly sound, and that if anyone had questions about the nature of that trip, they were welcome to write to the judge directly. He said it clearly and without aggression, just statement of fact, and he saw in Jim Dunbar's face the recalibration that happened when a man of established reputation offered his name in support of a claim. It did not eliminate the rumor. Rumors never fully died in small towns, but it changed its shape, made it contested rather than accepted, which was the best available outcome. What it did, as a side effect he had not planned for, was establish clearly in the social geography of Dry Creek that Wesley Carson was standing by Maude Hayes, which was a signal that people in small frontier towns understood the implications of very clearly. It invited interpretation, and the interpretation that most people landed on was that, whatever the exact nature of the relationship, Wesley Carson had made a choice, and people in Dry Creek knew him well enough to know that his choices were not casual. People started talking about that instead, and the talk about that was far less damaging than what Rutherford had started. Maude heard about what Wesley had done from Mrs. Dunbar, who reported it with unconcealed approval. Maude sat with that information for a long time, turned it over carefully in her mind the way you turned a smooth stone in your hand, feeling the weight of it. He had put his name beside hers publicly and deliberately, and without being asked, and he had done it knowing that it would be read as a statement, and he had done it anyway. She rode over the next morning with a pie. An apple pie, because she had dried apples from the summer, and the ability to make decent pastry was one of the things she had learned from her mother before her mother died when she was 15, and it was the only way she knew to return something that had no market price. He came to the door when she knocked and looked at the pie with an expression of authentic pleasure that was very different from polite gratitude, and she thought that was a small and honest revelation about a person, whether they received a homemade pie as a social obligation or as the actual thing it was. "Come in," he said. They had coffee and pie at his kitchen table, and the conversation moved differently than it had before, more comfortable, less careful. The way two people moved when the framework of what they were to each other had been established enough to relax into. He told her about a problem he was having with a sick calf, and she asked the right questions, not from knowledge but from attention, and they talked through it together, and she suggested soaking oats in warm water and adding molasses to the feed, something Elias had done with similar calves, and Wesley said he would try it and meant it, was not just being agreeable. When she got up to leave, he walked her to the door and she turned on the porch step and the sun was behind the barn and the light was the heavy amber of late afternoon, and she looked up at him on the porch above her and she said, "What you did in town. I want you to know I understand what it cost." "It cost nothing," he said. "It cost your neutrality," she said. "People are going to connect our names now, and some of them will make assumptions, and you will have to manage that." He looked at her for that moment again, the one with more duration in it than a casual look. "What if the assumptions are not entirely wrong?" he said. The sentence fell into the quiet of the late afternoon, and it had a precision to it, a careful honesty that she recognized as characteristic of him, never saying more than he meant, never less. She felt the familiar alarm that her careful self activated when things moved toward territory she did not control, and underneath the alarm, something warmer and more insistent that she had been trying not to examine directly. "Wesley," she said carefully, "I am in the middle of a legal crisis over the only property I have in the world, and I have been widowed for less than a month, and I know," he said quietly. "I'm not asking for anything. I just meant," he stopped. He seemed to be working out how to say it exactly. "I meant that I would not find it objectionable if the assumptions people made happened to become accurate at some point, when the timing was right. When you were ready," he paused, "if that was ever something you wanted." It was possibly the most carefully constructed declaration she had ever heard, so hedged with conditional clauses that it was nearly impossible to hold against him if she rejected it, and so honest underneath all that careful construction that it was impossible to dismiss. She stood on the porch step and looked at him and felt everything in her that was cautious and self-protective run its calculations, and then she said honestly, "I don't know what I want yet. I'm not ready to know." "I know," he said again, and this time it was an acceptance. "Take the time." She rode home in the amber light and told herself she was not smiling, and she was, undeniably, smiling. October moved through Taylor County in a long gold fade, the heat dropping degree by degree, the grass going yellow and then brown, the cattle growing their winter coats and looking stouter and more settled. Maude worked her property with a discipline that was partly necessity and partly therapy, the satisfaction of visible progress, the fence mended section by section, the barn repaired where the south wall had been pulling away from the foundation. She hired a man named Abner Walsh who came to her from the Tyler Ranch to the west, which had shut down its operation after a bad year, and who was a steady, experienced hand of about 40 who had heard about the dispute with Rutherford and had decided visibly that the side of the widow with the solid deed was the reliable side to be on. With Abner on the property, she had breathing room, and she used it to spend time she had not been able to spend, on the account books and on correspondence with a cattle buyer in Abilene about her fall stock, and on the slow, careful work of understanding fully what she had inherited and what it could become. Wesley came over twice that week, once with a question about her north fence line that had a genuinely practical basis, and once with no particular pretense of a practical purpose, just arriving at the end of a working day and sitting on her porch in the cooling evening air, and talking about nothing consequential, about the weather moving in from the northwest, and about a book he had been reading, which surprised her, and about the family of coyotes that had taken up residence near his East Spring, which did not. She found herself keeping better coffee for these visits. She noticed herself noticing this and found it amusing and a little alarming in equal measure. Rutherford Hayes made his next move in the middle of October. He appeared at the property with Mercer, and with a document that purported to be a letter from Elias Hayes, handwritten, expressing his intention to leave the property to his children from his first marriage, and stating that the deed transfer to Maude had been made under pressure and did not reflect his true wishes. The letter was dated 3 years ago. Maude read it in her doorway with Mercer watching her and Rutherford watching Mercer watching her, and she kept her face entirely still. The handwriting was good. It was close to Elias. But it was not quite right in 3 places she could identify: the way he formed the letter G, and the specific abbreviation he always used for property, and the spacing of his signature, which Elias had always written close and tight, and which this signature spread wider than he ever did. "I will need to have this examined," she said. "Leave me a copy." "We'll need to file the original with the county clerk," Mercer said smoothly. "Then I need to see the original before you file it," she said. "Bring it to Judge Holly's in Abilene and I will meet you there." Mercer and Rutherford exchanged the briefest of looks. "That won't be necessary," Mercer began. "It will be entirely necessary," Maude said. "Judge Holly's is already aware of this matter. I will be at his office on Thursday. If you wish this document to be taken seriously, you will be there with the original." She closed the door. She went directly to Wesley's property and told him about the letter, describing the handwriting discrepancies she had noticed with the specificity of someone who had handled Elias' correspondence for 4 years. Wesley listened and then said, "Elias signed every bill of sale that came through your property in the last 4 years. The county has those records, and Dunbar's has his account records with his signature on the credit register. There are reference signatures that can be compared to what they've produced." "A forgery," she said. "Almost certainly," he said, "and a clumsy one if you could identify the differences from memory. They may be banking on the fact that as his widow you would be emotionally destabilized by seeing his handwriting and less likely to scrutinize it carefully. They miscalculated that," she said with a flatness that made him look at her sharply, not in alarm but with something that might have been admiration. "They did," he said. "He rode with her to Abilene on Thursday." Judge Holly's looked at the letter, looked at 3 years of Elias Hayes' signatures on county documents, and spent approximately 15 minutes reaching the conclusion that was apparent to Maude in 3. He then looked at Mercer with the particular expression of a man who had been a judge for 30 years and had watched people make this kind of miscalculation before. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "this document is inconsistent with the confirmed signature patterns of Elias Hayes in 7 specific ways that I am now prepared to document for the record. I am directing you to explain where this document originated in the presence of this court's record." Mercer went the color of old flour. Rutherford Hayes left Dry Creek on a Saturday in late October, boarding a stage for Abilene with 1 bag, and the expression of a man who had spent considerable money and time on an enterprise that had turned entirely against him. Judge Holly's had made clear that any further legal action against Maude's deed would be treated as harassment, and that the attempted submission of a forged document was itself a matter of potential criminal consequence. Mercer had resigned the case. The threat was over. Maude stood on her porch that morning and watched the dust of the stage settle, and she did not feel triumph so much as the exhausted relief of someone who had been braced against a storm and could now slowly unbend. She went inside and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table and let herself be still for the first time in weeks. And in the stillness, she noticed the well rope through the window, the good hemp one that Wesley had replaced 2 months ago, and she thought of him appearing beside her before she had asked, and she thought about what he had said on her porch about assumptions not being entirely wrong, and she sat with that for a long time. Then she put on her coat and rode east along the fence line. He was at the house when she arrived, coming out of the barn with a harness draped over one arm, and he stopped when he saw her face and set the harness down on the fence rail. She dismounted and tied Clem to the post and walked up to him. "It's over," she said. "Rutherford left this morning." She saw relief move through his expression, genuine and unguarded, and it moved her to see it because it was relief on her behalf, for what she had been carrying, and there was something in that that reached past everything careful in her and arrived at something real. "Good," he said quietly. "I came to tell you," she said, "and I came to say." She stopped, tried again. "I'm not very practiced at this," she said, "at saying things that I feel rather than things I've concluded. I tend toward conclusions." He waited. He was very good at waiting. "I came to tell you that these past 2 months you have been," she searched for the word. "You have been someone I trust, and I do not use that word casually. I have had very few people in my life I could use it for honestly, and I think you should know that I know the difference." He was looking at her with that directness that was neither intimidating nor retreating, just fully present, and his expression had that quality she could now read well enough to know that it was the expression of someone who was holding something carefully. "Maude," he said, "I have been watching you for 2 months manage the kind of pressure that would have broken most people, and do it with more grace and more practical intelligence than almost anyone I have ever known. And I have been—" He paused in his own version of her difficulty. "I have had to be very careful not to say or do things too quickly, because I knew the timing was wrong, and I did not want to make this harder for you." She looked up at him. "The timing is better now," she said. He reached out and took her right hand carefully, the one that had healed from the rope, and held it in both of his with a gentleness entirely at odds with the size and strength of them, and he looked at her with everything no longer held behind careful management. "May I court you?" he said, formally, without self-consciousness, the language of his time and place and the genuine seriousness of his intention. "Yes," she said, "you may." The smile that crossed his face was the unguarded kind, the kind that came up from somewhere deep and was entirely unperformed, and it changed the whole landscape of how he looked, made him years younger and infinitely warmer, and Maude Hayes felt something shift permanently in her interior geography, some weight she had been carrying since before Elias died, since before Galveston, since before she had understood that life would require her to do most of it alone. She did not feel alone. The courtship of Maude Hayes and Wesley Carson was observed with considerable interest by the town of Dry Creek, which had very little other entertainment in the fall of 1882, and which had the particular investment of a small community in the romantic arrangements of its established members. It was conducted with a propriety that was partly genuine feeling and partly practical acknowledgement that Maude's reputation had been sufficiently tested by the fall's events and did not need further complication. He called on her at her house in the evenings twice a week. He took her to the church social in November, which was Dry Creek's primary communal gathering, and introduced her to the people she had not yet properly met, his neighbors and acquaintances, with a warmth in the introduction that communicated clearly what she was to him. She brought him pies, and he brought her fence wire, and they both pretended that these were practical exchanges rather than the exact texture of what was actually happening. In private, the courtship had its own language, made of conversation that went late into evenings by lamplight, and the specific ease of two people who had found the exact right shape of company in each other. He told her about his childhood on this land, his father who had been a quiet man and a careful one, his mother who had died of pneumonia 2 years ago, and whom he missed with the particular ache of someone who had been very close. She told him about Galveston, fully this time, and about the circumstances of her first marriage, the need and the loneliness in it, and the genuine care she had had for Elias alongside the absence of what she had not known yet she might eventually find. She told him about her mother and the pastry skills and her father who had worked on the docks and who had died when she was 17, leaving her with nothing except the ability to work hard and the bone-deep understanding that security had to be made, not waited for. He listened to all of it with the same attention he brought to everything, and he told her things he had not told many people, the 2 years of fighting to keep his property after his father died, the specific loneliness of those years, the way he had poured everything into the land because it was something concrete to hold on to, and the gradual realization, as he moved through his mid-twenties, that there was a version of succeeding at everything, and still having a life with a particular emptiness at its center. "I saw you," he said one evening in December, sitting at her kitchen table with the lamp turned low and the wind moving against the windows. "The first time, 3 years ago. You came to the county fair with Elias. I noticed you then." She looked at him. "You did. I noticed you were very capable," he said, "and I thought you looked like someone who had arranged her life very carefully around a particular absence." She absorbed that. "And now," he looked at her across the table with the certainty of someone who had thought about this extensively. "Now I think the absence is being addressed," he said. "In January he asked her to marry him. He did it on her porch, in the cold, clear morning with the frost on the grass and the cattle steam-breathing in the field. And he did it with a small garnet ring that had been his mother's, which he had retrieved from the box he kept at the bottom of his wardrobe, because he had known somehow that the time for it was coming. He held it out and looked at her and said, 'I want to spend my life beside you. I want to watch you build what you're building and build it with you. And I want to tell you things I've noticed and have someone to tell them to. And I want it to be you specifically for the rest of my life.' It was not a traditional romantic speech. It was entirely honest and entirely specific, and it was the most moving thing anyone had ever said to her. "Yes," she said, with the uncomplicated fullness of someone who had finished all her calculations and arrived at a clear answer. He slid the garnet ring onto her finger, and the cold of the morning made everything sharp and bright, and he kissed her for the first time on her porch in January, gently, and with the feeling of someone who had been careful for a long time and could now be something else. And she kissed him back, and felt the whole long architecture of the past 6 months resolve into a single point. They married in March of 1883 at the Dry Creek Church, which was a simple wooden building that did not require any particular pretension but which filled with people, because by then the community had decided collectively that this was a good development and they wished to witness it. Wesley stood at the front in his good coat and clean boots, with an expression of complete composure, and an interior state that he later described to Maude as terror of the productive kind, the kind you felt before something that mattered enormously. She came down the center aisle in a dress she had made herself over 3 weeks from a blue wool that was the closest thing to the color of the Gulf she had seen since she left Galveston, and she carried 3 wildflowers that she had found inexplicably blooming along the south pasture, despite the late cold, and she walked toward Wesley Carson with the particular confidence of someone who had chosen this with her whole self rather than being swept toward it. And she saw in his face, when he first looked at her, everything she needed to see. Judge Hollis came down from Abilene for the wedding, which touched them both and which he later said he had done because in 30 years he had rarely seen property disputes resolve as well as people. Mrs. Dunbar cried happily and loudly, which was expected. Abner Walsh, who had stayed on as Maude's hired hand, and who had by then developed a fierce loyalty to both Maude and the Carson operation, stood in the back row and looked deeply satisfied in the way of someone who had always known how things would go. They combined the properties. This was a practical matter that was also an enormous one, the question of whose name on what deed, and how the 2 operations would be run together. And they approached it with the same directness they brought to all practical matters, sitting at Maude's kitchen table with maps and account books and a lamp burning late, and making decisions together with a mutual respect that had the quality of something built rather than assumed. The Carson spread would remain in Wesley's name, but Maude's deed would remain in hers, and both would be filed together as jointly operated, which Judge Hollis facilitated with something approaching real pleasure. The cattle from both operations would be run together under one brand, a combined mark that incorporated the C of Carson and the H of Hayes, in a design that the county brand registrar approved on a Tuesday in April. Their first spring together was one of the finest working springs that Taylor County had seen in a decade. The rains came in useful intervals rather than all at once or not at all, The grass grew deep and green in the lowland sections. The cattle gained weight ahead of schedule. Wesley and Maude worked the land together with a complementary efficiency that surprised even them. Her instinct for the financial details, and his for the physical infrastructure combining into something more whole than either had managed alone. Maude put in the second well at the north end of the property in April, hiring the well digger Wesley recommended, who found the aquifer at 62 feet and declared it one of the better wells he had sunk in Taylor County. Wesley stood beside her when the water came up the first time, and she put her hand in the flow and felt the cool of it and looked up at him with a feeling she had no word large enough for, a feeling made of work and struggle, and the specific satisfaction of a thing completed that had once seemed impossible. "Good water," he said. "Very good water," she agreed. She was expecting their first child by summer's end, a fact she told him one morning over coffee with a directness that was characteristic of her, just looked up from her cup and said it plainly, and the expression that crossed his face was something she had never seen in it before. Something so open and so undefended that it made her own eyes sting for reasons she could not have explained precisely, except that it was the face of a man receiving a thing he had wanted deeply, and had not been certain he would have. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took both her hands and held them and said nothing for a moment and then said, quietly, "Thank you," which was the wrong thing to thank her for and the exact right sentiment for the moment. "It's not entirely my doing," she said. He laughed, and she laughed, and it was the specific laugh of two people who were deeply, fully happy in a way that did not require any external validation. The summer was long and hot, and Maude worked her portion of it standing at fences and managing accounts and making decisions about the fall cattle drive and doing all of the things she would have done if she had not been expecting a child, with some adjustments for comfort and practicality that she made without fuss and that Wesley facilitated without making her feel managed. He brought her water in the heat of the afternoon without being asked. He took on the heaviest physical labor with a naturalness that made it seem like inclination rather than accommodation. He built an extension on the farmhouse over August, adding a room to the south side that would be the nursery, working on it in the evenings, and on Sundays with the focused pleasure of a man making something specific for a specific purpose. Their son was born in November of 1883. A healthy and emphatically vocal boy who arrived on a Tuesday morning after a labor that Maude navigated with the same practical determination she brought to difficult fences and legal disputes, which Dr. Finch of Dry Creek, who was present, later said was the most composed he had seen a first-time mother. They named him Robert Elias Carson, Robert for Wesley's father and Elias for the man who had given Maude the ground she stood on. And the combination felt right, a bridge between what had come before and what they were building now. Wesley held his son for the first time with his big, careful hands and looked at the small face with an expression that Maude watched from the bed with a love so specific and so large that it was briefly overwhelming, the kind of love that had not been there before and now was permanent, could not be removed or returned, was simply part of the structure of things. "Hello," Wesley said to Robert Elias Carson, very quietly. "We've been waiting for you." Robert was a loud and energetic baby who slept in insufficient intervals, and who was interested in everything, and who showed signs at a very young age of his mother's absolute refusal to be stopped by things that presented themselves as obstacles. He was pulling himself to standing along the furniture at 9 months and walking by 11, and Maude watched him cross the kitchen floor on his unsteady legs toward the sunlight coming through the doorway, and thought that this was the thing, this specific, ordinary, remarkable thing, that she had not known 4 years ago in Galveston that she was moving toward, and the knowledge of it filled her from the inside out. The years that followed were full. Taylor County continued its complicated development through the 1880s, the railroads extending their reach, the range wars that visited neighboring counties mostly sparing Dry Creek through a combination of geography and the kind of long-established relationships that Wesley had built over 12 years of fair dealing. The Carson Hayes operation grew steadily, adding cattle and eventually a small number of horses that Maude began breeding with a methodical seriousness that produced, within 3 years, animals of sufficient quality to command attention from buyers as far as Fort Worth. The horses were her particular project, the thing she had chosen rather than inherited, and she threw herself into understanding them with the same self-education she had applied to cattle and fences and law, reading everything she could obtain, corresponding with breeders in Kentucky whose methods were different but whose knowledge was considerable, learning from watching and doing in the patient way that she had learned most things. Wesley watched her do this with a pride that was entirely unqualified, the pride of someone who loved a person becoming more fully themselves. "We're going to end up running a significant horse operation," he said one evening, watching her go over breeding records at the kitchen table. "Yes," she said without looking up, "that's the plan." "You might need more land," he said. She looked up. "Are you suggesting we expand?" "I'm suggesting we look at the Tanner property to the southwest," he said. "They're considering selling. The grazing is good and the creek runs more reliably than ours." She looked at him for a moment. "You've been thinking about this?" "For about a month," he said. "You could have said something a month ago," she said. "I was waiting to see where your horse operation was going," he said. "I didn't want to suggest expansion until I was sure you wanted to go that direction." She set down her pen. "Wesley Carson," she said, with a warmth in her voice that she no longer attempted to modulate, "after 5 years you still think you need to wait until I've decided before you say what you're thinking." He smiled, the full unguarded one that still arrived without warning and still changed the entire quality of the room. "Old habits," he said. "Talk to me about the Tanner property," she said. Now, they talked about it for 2 hours, and they went to look at it the following week, and they bought it in the spring of 1888. 12 years that added a strong third tributary to an already robust operation. Maude's horses were sold at the Fort Worth market that year for prices that made the other ranchers look twice at the Carson brand, and she came home from that market with the accounts balanced and a surplus she had not had since the first year of the marriage. And the surplus felt different from anything else she had managed because it was hers and Wesley's both. Made together out of combined work and combined intelligence and the specific alchemy of two people who were entirely themselves and entirely each other's at the same time. Their second child arrived in 1887, a daughter they named Clara Louise, who had Maude's brown eyes and Wesley's steady temperament, and who was from her earliest weeks possessed of a thoughtful quality, a watchfulness that made Maude laugh sometimes because it was so familiar, the expression of someone taking things in and processing them, and not yet declaring conclusions. "She's exactly like you," Wesley said, looking at Clara in her crib. "She's exactly like you," Maude said. "We may have a problem," he said, in the tone that meant he was not even slightly concerned. Robert, at 4, regarded his new sister with the caution of someone encountering a complicated and possibly permanent situation, and then, after approximately 2 weeks of adjustment, became her most devoted companion, the relationship between them developing into one of those sibling partnerships that seem to be less about affection in the soft sense and more about alliance. Two people with complementary and different qualities who were better together than separately. Which Maude recognized and was quietly moved by. The years arranged themselves into something that felt, from the inside, like the accumulation of a life that had actually been allowed to happen rather than one constructed out of necessity and endurance. There were difficulties, because difficulty was the texture of any real life, and the West in the 1880s did not run short of it. A drought year in 1886 that required every calculation they had, and the kind of financial tightening that brought back muscle memory of worse times. A horse lost to illness in 1889 that had been one of Maude's best mares, and whose loss she mourned with a specificity that Wesley understood and respected, sitting with her on the porch that evening without trying to make it better, just present. A dispute with a new neighbor over water rights in 1890 that involved a return visit to Judge Holly's, who was by then quite old and who greeted them with the warmth of someone who had watched them from the beginning and was pleased with what they had become. Through all of it they talked, which was the thing they had built first, and which turned out to be the load-bearing structure of everything else. They talked about the property, and about their children, and about what was happening in the wider world that reached them through newspapers weeks late and word of mouth carried on the wind of travelers. They talked about what they remembered and what they hoped for, and what they noticed, the way a particular sunset landed on the north pasture, and the way Robert at 7 had started asking questions about how things worked that had the same quality as Wesley at 7 apparently asking them. A detail Wesley's mother had mentioned before she died, and which Maude filed and kept. On a September evening in 1891, 9 years after a frayed rope had slipped through her burning palms and Wesley Carson had appeared beside her before she asked, Maude Hayes Carson stood at the new north well, the one they had sunk in that first spring, and lowered the bucket on the good rope that had been replaced twice in 9 years and pulled it up full and easy, the pulley turning smooth and true, the water coming up cold and clear and exactly as it should. The sun was going down over the western pasture in the colors she had never stopped being startled by, the orange and the gold, and the particular shade of rose that appeared for about 3 minutes just before the light went entirely. Wesley came up behind her and put one hand on her shoulder and stood beside her looking at the same sky, and she leaned back into him slightly, and they stood together at the well they had built and the land they had kept and the life they had made out of everything that had almost gone wrong and all the things that had gone exactly right. Robert told me today he wants to breed horses, Wesley said. Of course he does, she said. Clara told me she wants to be a judge, he said. Maude laughed. The laugh came from deep down and was entirely real. Of course she does, she said again. We are going to have a very complicated household in about 15 years, he said. We already have a very complicated household, she said. I know, he said, with contentment so thorough it was nearly audible. I love it. She turned and looked at him in the last of the September light, this man who had appeared beside her when she was struggling, and had never once made her feel diminished by the help, who had been patient when patience was required and direct when directness was required and present always, which was the rarest and most important of all the things he was. She looked at him and felt the same thing she felt every morning when she woke up on this land they shared, a bone-deep settled certainty that was the exact opposite of the fear she had carried for so long, the certainty that this was real and solid and hers, not because she had had no choice, but because she had chosen it with everything she had, every calculation and every feeling and every part of herself that she had spent so long managing and protecting, and was now here in this life. Fully allowed to simply be. I love you, she said. He looked at her with those eyes that had never once hidden what was in them from her, not since the morning at the well when he had read her face and known what she needed and given it without requiring her to ask. I love you, he said. I have loved you since before I knew what to do with it. What did you do with it, she asked. Replaced your well rope, he said, and waited. She laughed and he pulled her against him, and they stood there in the fading September light at the edge of everything they had built, the land spreading west and south in its enormous, unhurried beauty, the cattle moving in the far field, the lamps coming on one by one in the house windows where their children were inside being exactly themselves, and the world going on around them with all its difficulty and all its grace. The third child, a boy they named James William, arrived in the spring of 1893, the year that Taylor County began the slow transition into a different kind of Texas, the open range giving way to the fenced and documented and increasingly ordered landscape of the late frontier. And the Carson operation sat at the center of it with a solidity that had been built by two people who had refused to be lost and had found each other in the finding of themselves. James was a peaceable baby, content in a way that Robert had never been, and Clara had been only in her own thoughtful fashion. A child who slept when sleeping was appropriate, and who observed the world from his mother's arms with an expression of such tranquil interest that Dr. Finch called him the easiest patient he had seen in 20 years of practice. Maude held him on the porch in the spring evenings and watched the horses in the south pasture, and felt the accumulation of it all, the weight that was not burden but ballast, the specific gravity of a life with enough in it to keep you grounded to the earth. Wesley sat beside her and read his book, and occasionally said the things he had noticed: the way the mockingbird had returned to the cedar east of the barn, the angle of the light suggesting a weather shift by morning, the particular way Robert and Clara were arguing in the yard below with the gestures of two people who had learned the argument entirely from each other, and therefore each knew exactly what was coming next. "Do you remember," Maude said, "what you told me on the way to Abilene that first time? About your father telling you things he'd noticed?" He looked up from his book. "Yes, this is that," she said. "What you do, you tell me things you notice, every day." He looked at her for a long moment with all the warmth of 9 years and the certainty of everything that had been built. "I never want to stop," he said. "Don't," she said. The evening settled around them, warm and ordinary and full of exactly what they had made of it, and the land went on in every direction under a sky that was, as it always was, never the same sky twice, always astonishing, always there. Robert came up onto the porch with a question about the horses, and Clara followed him to correct his question to something more precise, and James slept in Maude's arms through all of it, and Wesley answered Robert and listened to Clara and looked, between answers, at his wife in the evening light with an expression that had been on his face in one form or another since the September morning 9 years ago when a rope had slipped, and he had moved without thinking to be beside her. She had had it then. He had known she had it. He had come anyway, and that had been the beginning of everything, and everything since had been a continuation of that same essential impulse. To be beside her, to be present, to be the person who arrived before being asked, because he would always rather be too close than too far from wherever she was. The sun finished its descent, and the stars came out over Taylor County, Texas, in the reliable way they had been coming out since before any of them were here and would continue after, and the Carson family sat on their porch under the enormous sky and were exactly where they were supposed to be, which was together, which was home, which was everything.